Good day, everyone. Today, we're going to chat about a topic that many people, but not me, have covered many times before: LGBT people in media. Specifically movies, but also TV shows and other forms, I guess. These days, there are often characters written in that are gay, lesbian, bi, or trans, sometimes multiple of these and other identities. This isn't new. There have been movies and shows with these characters before. It seems like it has become more common, or at least less stigmatized than previously. Unfortunately, my take is pretty cynical, and I believe that the studios and platforms that make the media don't actually care about these characters, and rather they care about money. That's fine. The people who write, design, and do all the other work to make the piece of media, they likely do care about these characters and stories, though. Otherwise, why would they push for representation? That's just my take. There can be nuance elsewhere. For now, let's look at how LGBT identities have been portrayed in the media over the years. Also, to be clear, almost all of this will be USA-centric, both for familiarity for me and because it needs to be a manageable size presentation. Personally, I was hard-pressed to name more than a couple of instances of LGBT characters that I could remember over the years. In fact, the only ones I could name come from my youth and involve incredibly harmful stereotypes and couldn't be read as anything but negative portrayals. So I went and looked up a handful of movies, and I'm basing this on that research rather than my first-hand experience. I'm using research pretty broadly. Most of this is going to be my opinion. There's a long-standing trope in media that LGBT people are the butt of jokes or played for laughs. This perception is what I was familiar with growing up, seeing trans people on shows like Jerry Springer. Imagine something like a tabloid-like talk show mixed with a wrestling show, or Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, which I can't even begin untangling just yet. I can't say how starved I was for representation that wasn't bad, because at the time I saw these and I remember being upset, but not having the vocabulary or understanding of why. I didn't come out for several decades afterwards, probably in part because of how these portrayals affected my perception of how I would be perceived. For movies specifically, there was a form of self-censorship that was agreed upon from about 1929 to 1968. This was colloquially known as the Hays Code, but was also called the Motion Picture Production Code. Getting past this filter could mean the difference in a movie getting to a theater at all. The Hays Code was a list of do's and don'ts about what could be portrayed on screen. You couldn't have profanity or nudity, but you also couldn't have sexual perversion. I'm not entirely sure how vague that actually is, but it did effectively mean no LGBT characters, because they were viewed as morally bad or perverse. There were exceptions, or people trying to get around the rules. Also, this code didn't apply to foreign films, but it definitely influenced how LGBT people are shown on the screen. This entire system would later be replaced by things like the MPAA ratings you see today, where films are given a rating. That was a lot, but why did I bring it up? To start, the Hays Code meant that there was almost no representation in media. If there was, it was usually done to show that a character was morally bad or needed fixing, or played as a joke. After the abandonment of the code, representation still wasn't easy to come by. I'm basing this entirely on a sampling of Wikipedia articles and my own research bias. Often the characters were hinted to be LGBT rather than ever stating anything outright or explicitly. Some of this is hints in dialogue, and others are hinted at via tropes that evolved as shorthand. If they were explicitly stated to be LGBT, they may have been controversial characters. This may be where the mockery comes from in many media. It was pretty difficult for me to find tons of examples because while there are a lot of LGBT characters, the roles are often minuscule and the references vague enough to be ignored by many. Only the most egregious, negative stuff stayed with me. A lot of this is changing. I've seen many more LGBT characters in media recently than in the past. Like I said, I believe it's media wanting money, but it is much easier than in the past to get your entertainment from many sources. Sometimes the characters work, other times maybe not. Unfortunately, I have heard firsthand the argument that LGBT characters are in everything and being shoved in my face. I've seen it, I'm sure you have too, but from the perspective of a writer, how else would you explicitly make clear that a character is trans or gay or lesbian without either putting in clunky dialogue or showing a side story for that character? Nearly every character that doesn't say so or doesn't conform to existing cliches will be taken as cis-het otherwise. Part of this might be because the LGBT characters are not the major characters for the story, and so they seem like it's shoehorned in that they are queer somehow. I've also heard criticisms for casting non-LGBT actors for roles that are explicitly about or portraying LGBT people. This is a whole can of worms that I don't have the time to detangle. The short version of it is that cis-het people will have many of the LGBT roles without really a consideration for people who may have life experience and bring more to the role. There's a huge problem with cis men playing trans women in media as well. It's problematic, to say the least. One of the examples that kind of fits in with my cynical take is Disney including LGBT characters in their movies, but then taking them out or making them so minor that they can be taken out for release in other countries. The example of the lesbian kiss in Star Wars Rise of Skywalker being taken out in other markets. Another recent example, and one done in probably a much better way, but not sure yet, is Elliot Page in Umbrella Academy. I think it's a good thing because it shows that we can tell those stories. We don't have to force someone to play a character that isn't in line with their identity. And I don't mean in the sense that, like, I'm playing a doctor, but I'm not really a doctor. I mean men playing women or women playing men. Why did I bring up the Hays Code? To show that there was outright censorship of LGBT representation in media, and that persisted even after the abandonment of the code. As alluded to earlier, one of the ways around the restrictions involved making the LGBT characters the villains. Many popular Disney villains are queer-coded. This reinforces the idea that queer is bad. Other ways in which LGBT topics are stifled is and was labeling it as sexual, just because it features LGBT characters. As an example, YouTube will flag your video as sexual if you mention lesbian. I'm not saying you can't enjoy media that is maybe somewhere between problematic and outright hostile. You can. That's for you to decide. Just recognize that a character being LGBT isn't enough for them to be a bad person. Pay some attention to what you're consuming. Is the joke that trans women are just men in dresses, or that gay people are feminine, or that women being with women is okay as long as they are shown to actually be straight later? We didn't even touch on the male gaze. That's G-A-Z-E. When I said mostly cishet actors are being chosen for LGBT roles, this has the effect that the experience of LGBT people may not be thought of. Things might get stripped down to just the cliches. For example, many movies or shows might feature things from the perspective that queer people are just about sex, or that showing women engaging in sapphic behavior is fine because straight men find that attractive. But women loving women aren't doing that to make men attracted to them. I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said on this, and much better than I can do. This small aside is just to make the point that when the writers, directors, actors, etc. are not part of the community that they're portraying, the content is less likely to contain accurate portrayals. This video doesn't present a solution and certainly isn't explaining everything in depth. It's just a glimpse into how we got where we are now. It is very difficult for just LGBT people to advocate for change as we are not part of the majority. Being an ally and speaking up when you see something could help. And probably will. Passively observing will not. You might be thinking that sounds like a lot of work, and it is. LGBT people don't usually get the choice whether they can participate or not in these areas. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, feel free to leave a comment.